Hello, I'm Theo Black.
And I'm Sarah Black.
Documentaries are the unloved stepchild of the film industry.
But, like all movies, they deserve love.
Especially when they push the boundaries of non-fiction and fiction.
Follow us into the mystery
and fascination that is our world.
You made me watch a movie.
It was called The Fear of 13. Spoilers. We always talk about spoilers. We don't hide anything. Even specifically with this movie, we really are going to talk about spoilers out of order. Spoilers. Cheers. Today's cockatil, is water.
The finest. This is not the player's water.
Not like a Vittel water?
No, this is tap water, even specifically. Drink some tap water along at home with us. I feel like you should start this one.
So why is it called The Fear of 13?
It's one of the words he learns. Triskaidekaphobia.
Yeah. Fear of 13 is a video recording of Nick Yaris, a man who spent over 20 years on death row for a murder he didn't commit, talking about things.
Yep. That's the story.
Yep. That's the problem, though. Let's get into it. To say I was disappointed by this would be a lie, because I went into this absolutely not knowing what you were showing me. I knew nothing. I knew the title was Fear of 13, and I knew it was a documentary. We start with Nick Yaris talking, and then we go to these intertitles. And I think these intertitles set things up really wrong.
The dreaded intertitles, which I have not... which I have heard of almost every day since we watched this, I feel like.
We don't talk every day.
No. But I've heard about them a lot. And to be fair, yes, I agree. Because
the documentary itself is interesting. And it is Nick Yaris going kind of stream of consciousness as far as we can tell. Just talking about things that happened and eventually getting into kind of a linear narrative. And we'll get into all that.
Yeah.
But I don't know that. I don't know who this guy is. I don't know anything. But there are these intertitles that say... And so now this is what I know about this guy who I'm watching.
A murderer.
He's on death row, so he was convicted of murder of some kind, and he's been asked to be killed, and he's being interviewed about that decision.
Which we're gonna let you know right now does not pan out the way you think it might.
But it heavily implies that he is still on death row, and that you're talking to him while he's on death row. He's not, there's nothing in the background to clue you in. And he's wearing some rather plain
clothes. He's not wearing prison clothes.
No.
But I also don't know enough about prison to know that what he might even be wearing.
Yes.
And then we follow that with two stories that aren't connected to either to the intertitles. Just a story of somebody getting killed in the prison and everybody eating right afterwards.
Two guys were arguing because one guy didn't get enough bread on his tray. And I'm like, this is crazy. You're so whacked out of your mind that you're going to call down to the guard, hey man, I only got one slice of bread on my tray, when a human being just died.
And I can imagine that being a harrowing experience. And a story about two gay inmates who end up getting split up.
I guess Wesley went crazy in that cell.
And it's an interesting story. not connected to anything else.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about those intertitles, and this guy's a murderer, and I'm like, where are we going with this?
This voice took over.
One of the things about storytelling, and this applies both to novels and movies, is usually the beginning sets you up for the rest of the movie or the book or whatever we're talking about. Of course, there's always ways you can subvert things and be very clever and so on. But if you start with like a hard, edgy car chase with like violence and the next thing that happens is like some ditzy girl has trouble getting ready for work,
yeah,
you're mostly going to be a little confused and what the fuck. This documentary starts with a setup that you're hearing an interview with a death row inmate who's going to die soon.
And, as we mentioned, spoilers all the time, that's not what's actually happening.
It's not. And they don't say explicitly that that's what's happening. They don't lie. But
they don't lie, but...
It's really, really implied.
This feels like someone is trying to pull one over you.
It really does.
They could have, whoever made this documentary, and it's not bad by any means, they did a decent job, they could have done it in a way where I didn't feel as kind of like, about the whole thing. And I liked the documentary. I showed it to Sarah.
Yeah.
Because I ultimately think it's interesting, but it leaves that odd taste in your mouth. Like, you just kind of pulled one.
Because here's what happened to me. I spend the next hour thinking, where are we going? What are we doing? When are we going to talk about the execution? When are we going to... We set me up with this, why aren't we going back to it? And it then distracts me from... I'm listening to this monologue about these gay inmates, and I'm like, so? Like, I mean, it's an interesting story, but what does it have to do with anything?
They could have opened on, like, the crime that he committed. They could have opened on the escape attempt.
Which is crazy. That's a crazy story.
And now I'm looking at them as they're yelling at each other who was the bigger idiot for letting this happen, and then I hear them.
That would have been a good open. It would have followed. You would have tracked with that.
Well, and something we have to be clear about, if you haven't seen this documentary, it is entirely composed of Nick Yaris sitting and talking in a very, I want to say erudite. Is that the right word? I want to sound.
Have you ever used the word erudite?
I want to sound.
I haven't used the word erudite before.
Having or showing great knowledge or learning, which is exactly what he's doing, because the whole point is that he
learned a lot.
Learned a lot while he was in jail or prison. Is there a difference? I don't know.
Yeah.
Where the hell was I going with this? Oh, so him talking and telling these stories in a very compelling manner, and reenactments that are mostly close-ups of hands or feet or windows or water or fences. And I sound angry, but I'm not that angry.
He is interesting.
Yes.
So moving past the funky opening, he is interesting.
Yes.
He makes the story about the gay inmates interesting. He
Right.
makes the story about, somebody being murdered and them all eating right after it interesting. It is him that does it. He is a powerful storyteller.
Yeah.
I think he does motivational speaking to some degree now, or did. I haven't looked in a while. And he is why you watch this, is because he is fascinating.
And he has not a unique experience. I recently read a New Yorker article about, I'm going to embarrass myself, the something 3, the Angola 3? Does that sound like a thing?
You're looking up while you do it, too.
I know. The Angola 3, who were 3 black men who were in solitary for the longest time ever. And it's not a dissimilar story, even what they had to talk about solitary and how they got through it. So it's not a unique story, but it's certainly not a common story, and it's an interesting story, and he has an interesting way of saying it.
Yeah, he uses words like gregarious, and he calls something coffee-colored urine at one point, which is just like, I wish I wrote like that. He's using these great words.
Then I would move on to phantasmagoria, and I would understand that phantasmagoria was the fear of ghosts, and I'd like, boo,
Well, and part of what happened is he went in a pretty messed up drug addict. He wasn't actually a murderer, as it turns out, but he was not in a great place in his life.
He was not exactly your standard civilian.
Yeah, and even after his escape, he kind of finally shaped up and he kind of educated himself and he read a lot, and that's part of the reason he can talk the way he does is because he educated himself.
In the front of the General Education Development booklet was a note, Tips of Learning, and it said, if you take a word and write out its spelling 10 times while covering each previous one, and then apply each of those to 10 sentences using that word, you will not forget that word. The 10 times rule.
And if I hadn't been thinking, am I going to have to watch this guy die? Is this going to end with him dead?
Well, and plus...
Did he do it? Am I watching a murderer talk really eloquently?
That's
and that
the thing.
distracted me from every story he told.
They don't even give you the inkling of that. Like, I can understand them opening it and being they're trying to fool you. But then them sort of laying the groundwork of like, well, something's not what it seems. Mm-hmm. They don't do that. They don't lay any groundwork for you to have that suspicion. So you are just watching it thinking, I'm listening to a murderer talk?
Yeah. Which,
depending on your own views of life and all that kind of thing, can either be like, no, I don't want to listen to a murderer talk, or well, I'm curious about the human experience.
Yeah. Or, I mean, even when it becomes clear that he says he's innocent, there are plenty of criminals who say they're innocent.
It's a rather
Some
common
of them
thing.
are, some of them aren't. Like,
I didn't kill that woman.
But they do still try and tell a story after they tell the other two stories.
Because there's two things that are happening, and that's why it's like they are trying to tell a story, but and they have a follow through. We're still following Nick Yaris, and that's our story we're following, and he's telling individual stories within that story.
Yeah,
that's a separation.
Mm-hmm.
It is hard to follow that progression.
It takes a while before it actually starts getting linear.
Yeah.
I mean, when he starts talking about his escape, I had no idea when in his time on death row that had taken place. Like earlier, later. Well, it was earlier.
Yeah.
It was close to when but then he goes back in time. I mean, because he goes back and it's non-linear.
Yeah.
Because then later he goes back in time to talk about what he was even there for. I mean, finding out what he was even on death row for comes after the middle of the documentary.
I'm pretty sure it's after the middle.
They take me back to the cell, and there was the newspaper. The December 16th Delaware County Daily Times.
Which is a problem. It takes so long for you to understand, because they set up all this other stuff, but they don't set that up.
Yeah. Does it come before or after he talks about his wife, his first wife?
Gosh, it might become after.
Yeah.
I don't even know. I don't know how much of what just happened I kept in when I edited this, but we just had trouble placing something in the story. Because it's so nonlinear, it's like, we don't remember where he talks about his first wife.
Yeah. She wore shoes and had a notebook. I can tell you that much.
And yeah, it's hard to go from all these events to one after the other and feel like you're following a coherent story.
I think it's trying to kind of have a nonlinear, interesting documentary, because the whole thing is just one guy telling stories, which is like, it wouldn't be the first nonlinear experimental documentary, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, it's almost being a true crime story, talking about a man who was a drug addict, who escaped prison this crazy way, who went on to spend years trying to exonerate himself during the time when DNA was becoming a real thing, which is, an interesting story in itself. But it just skates over that. These things are mixed together, and they do not mix very well.
Which should be the backbone of the story, that, the DNA evidence, his escape, ends up being moments in the story.
Right.
It doesn't have a full follow through the whole thing.
Yes. Not to harp on the intertitles, but without those, it might have worked better. You might have gotten away with mixing those two disparate ideas, because I wouldn't have been expecting the linear narrative. I still don't think it necessarily would have worked.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have been expecting something I didn't get.
Yeah. And so as we get to the end of the documentary, we actually finally get sort of some resolution on the intertitles.
The very first thing I did later on that evening is I sat by a very bright light at my desk and I wrote a letter to the judge handling my appeals.
And by now we've figured out, well, he's innocent. And it's taken a while to get there. So now we're following, well, is he going to get off? Are we listening to him tell his story before he dies? You still actually don't know. You feel like you're probably not going to watch this man die, or, what will be his last words. But you don't know. And it sort of has a number of false finishes, I consider it, because...
Do you feel that false finishes become before or after you find out for sure he's innocent?
Well, he's already sent his DNA, and he's trying to get that all figured out, and his wife, leaves him.
Right, but they don't actually successfully test it for a while.
So you don't know.
Yeah. People have submitted DNA for testing and turned out to be guilty before. People do weird shit, man.
Right, and you don't know, but you think he might be innocent.
Yeah.
And so then he gets sick, and that feels like a weird...
He has hepatitis C, I think. Yeah.
And he thinks he's dying.
Yeah.
And that's when I found out I was dying.
And, it is a serious illness, but that sort of almost feels like an ending, even though it's not. Mm-hmm. It just sort of feels like it. And then he sends his letter in that he wants, to a speedy trial. And then he finally gets the DNA tested. And each of these things are happening, and each one of them sort of feels like it's about to finish up, and it shouldn't.
Yeah.
I don't know why it feels that way.
Well, because we're expecting to get to the point where he's doing this interview.
Yeah.
We're still set up to believe that this interview is going to be about his decision to end his appeals and get executed. And we never actually get there because this interview is after he's out of jail.
Yeah.
So I think that's why it feels false that way. There was also a number of just failures that happened. He had really bad luck.
They take the new evidence and they send it out to California and they improperly package it and it burst open in transit.
That is harrowing
to
think about as a person. But I really think why you feel like it wasn't reaching its conclusion is because we've been set up for a conclusion that didn't happen.
There's no resolution really on that setup.
And it's kind of weirdly dissatisfying, even though, you're glad that this guy who didn't do the crime got out.
Yeah.
But I think about the other stories it could have told, because part of his story was that this is horrible and awful and no one should go through this. At the same time, he entered it as a messed up drug addict, and it kind of straightened him out in a weird way. That could have been an interesting story to tell, and just the weird conflict that you could feel about something like that. But it's just one of the many things that gets touched on and moved off of.
Yeah, it's almost a documentary of ideas.
Yeah.
And he's telling you all these different ideas, and the documentary is telling you all these different ideas. And it doesn't quite hit on anyone enough for you to really feel like you got to see that part.
Yes.
And that's hard. And when you finally get to the end and there's no resolution, it doesn't tell you, well, he sent that letter in so that they would do his DNA. They didn't tell...
Well, that's part of the problem, too, that we didn't mention is... Okay, so in theory, this interview is to find out about his decision to stop appeals and get executed. And then it turns out that in doing this, he basically forces their hand to test that DNA evidence.
Yeah.
Did he know that's what was going to happen? Did he do that for that reason, or did he just want to die? I actually don't know.
I feel like maybe what it's trying to say is he was being clever, but you're right. I have no idea.
And the lead up to that was that he was so sick he thought he was dying, so was he just going to do suicide by death row?
Yeah. It's unfulfilling.
Yeah. And on top of that, the visuals were a mixed bag.
We've touched on it a little bit already, but it's a lot of reenactment footage, done very stylistically, and I actually think some of the shots they do are really neat. But there's also some stuff that doesn't fit. For instance, there's a scene where, right at the beginning when he's talking about the gay men being together, there's a scene of the jail and they're all holding mirrors. You don't know why the mirrors are there.
Is that a thing?
Is that a thing?
I've never been on death row. I don't know.
And we see the woman in her shoes and the notepad who's his wife.
I fixated on that notepad. I'm like, what's she writing in there? What's going on? Some of them, you're right. when he's talking about the gay men's relationship, there's a lot of shots kind of like up in a prison or a jail. I don't know the difference again. And it's very lonely. And you can imagine maybe for a moment what it might be like to be there. But then other ones made me think of all those ID shows that I've seen, just done a little more stylized. It even, sometimes it was just so literal. It's like, and then, you know, I let her go. We couldn't be together anymore. So what do you see? You see feet walking away. It doesn't elevate what he's saying. The most interesting thing is still what he's saying, and that didn't give me anything more.
It doesn't plant any contrary seeds to try and give you a hint. It doesn't try to elevate the material. It doesn't try to make the material more sophisticated. It's a bit by the numbers.
Yeah.
And I do want to highlight the powerful images, because one of the reasons I keep thinking about this documentary, besides Nick Yaris, and he really is the reason to watch it, is all these images of water and the interesting way water is being used all throughout the documentary.
I literally couldn't walk.
And it's just kind of clever, and I liked it.
When we watched Searching for Sugar Man, it was like, don't watch this, go see Searching for Sugar Man.
Yeah.
Go into it with nothing.
Yeah.
With this, I almost want to say, you're gonna watch a guy, he's off death row, he's talking about his experiences. And then I think you could watch it and enjoy it more. Yeah. I almost think you need to know that ahead of time, because then you can just relax and enjoy it.
Yes.
I almost feel like I could watch this a second time and potentially enjoy it more, because I won't be like...
I enjoyed it more, I think, when I watched it with you, because that was still only my second time seeing it. Mm-hmm. And I really felt like I was getting more out of it because of that. Yeah. I had the sense after watching it the first time, like I said, that they pulled one over on me, that they tricked me. Yeah. And watching it the second time, I just got to enjoy it and be like, here's Nick Yaris telling these fascinating stories, using the word gregarious. I'm going to keep using it because I like that word, gregarious.
Yeah.
It's great, but it has that layer of being sort of encapsulated within a documentary that doesn't feel wrapped up.
As I was no. On this series, The Thin Gray Line, we have watched Searching for Sugar Man, which is a very strong narrative documentary, and then this, Fear of 13, which didn't know whether it wanted to be narrative or non-narrative. So I think what we should watch next is Wisconsin Death Trip, which is what I think is non-narrative done well, and you can tell me if you agree or not. So you should like us, because we're really likable, and we talk about movies, and who doesn't like people talking about movies? So I think you subscribe down here. Does anything happen up there?
No.
Or here? No, okay, just down there.
Yeah.
Just like us down there. Do it down there. Also, that sounded dirty.
Also subscribe and comment and share.
I said subscribe. You also need to comment and share. But above all else,
keep watching movies.
Don't know what this is.